My name is Diana. In the world I was born into, the only thing that mattered was the cold, sterile gleam of glass and steel. My family, the Vane dynasty, built their fortune on high-frequency trading and metropolitan real estate, assets you can't touch, only calculate. My brother, Arthur, was the golden heir, a man whose soul was as hollow as the skyscrapers he managed. I was the outlier, the daughter who found more wisdom in the cycles of the seasons than in a quarterly profit report. When the will was read, it was a choreographed execution of my dignity. Arthur received the empire, the firm, the liquid millions, the luxury fleet. I was handed a crumpled deed to a derelict, sun-bleached farm in the middle of a forgotten valley. "It's a fitting grave for your lack of ambition," my father had said with his final breath. They thought they were discarding me like chaff. They forgot that the earth doesn't care about your bank account. It only cares about the strength of your back and the depth of your resolve. I didn't just inherit a ruin, I inherited the raw materials of a revolution. The boardroom was silent, save for the rhythmic ticking of a clock that cost more than most people's homes. Arthur sat at the head of the table, his silk tie perfectly knotted, a smirk of predatory satisfaction playing on his lips. He didn't look like a grieving son, he looked like a general who had just won a bloodless coup. "To Arthur Vane," the attorney intoned, his voice echoing against the mahogany walls, "I bequeath the controlling interest in Vane Global, the Manhattan penthouse, and all associated offshore holdings." Arthur didn't blink. He simply adjusted his cufflinks, the gold catching the afternoon light. It was exactly what he expected. It was his birthright. "And to Diana Vane," the attorney continued, his tone shifting to something bordering on mockery, "the property known as Dry Creek Ridge, along with its remaining agricultural equipment, the outstanding land debts, and the original farmhouse." Arthur let out a sharp, dry bark of a laugh. "Dry Creek? You mean that patch of dust where grandfather used to hide from his creditors? Father always said you had a simple mind, Diana. Now you have 10 acres of dead soil to match it. Perhaps you can start a collection of interesting rocks. It's certainly all that will ever grow there." "It's land, Arthur," I said, my voice cutting through his laughter like a frost. "Something you can't delete with a keystroke." "It's a liability," he countered, standing up and smoothing his jacket. "But look on the bright side. While I'm navigating the global markets, you'll have plenty of time to talk to the crows. Don't worry about the city apartment. I've already had your things packed and sent to the Ridge. I wouldn't want you to be late for your new life as a peasant." I drove to Dry Creek Ridge that evening. The farm was a visceral insult. The house was a skeletal wreck, its gray timber silvered by decades of neglect. The barns groaned under the weight of the wind, and the fields were a cracked, desolate expanse of shale and stubborn weeds. There was no running water, the fences were ghosts of wire and rot, and the nearest town was a 30-minute crawl over broken asphalt. I stood in the center of the yard, the dust coating my boots, and I felt the crushing weight of their contempt. They hadn't just given me a farm, they had given me a prison made of dirt. They expected me to break within a month, to come crawling back to the city to beg Arthur for a job in the mailroom. I knelt down and pushed my fingers into the soil. It was hard, yes. It was thirsty. But as I dug deeper, past the parched surface, I felt a strange, vibrating warmth. This wasn't dead soil. It was dormant. It was volcanic earth, rich in minerals, shielded by the unique shadow of the surrounding cliffs. "You think this is a wasteland," I whispered to the silence, "but I see a fortress." The first 3 years were a slow-motion war. I sold my car, my jewelry, and my inheritance from my grandmother just to buy a solar-powered well pump and a few thousand dormant saplings. I slept in a sleeping bag on the floor of the kitchen, the only room where the roof didn't let in the stars. My hands, once soft, became a landscape of calluses and scars. I learned the language of the shovel and the wrench. I spent my days clearing miles of invasive scrub by hand, my muscles screaming in protest until they eventually turned to iron. I spent my nights studying organic viticulture and soil regeneration by the light of a single LED lantern. When the local ranchers passed, they'd slow their trucks and watch me work, their faces masks of pity. "That ground is stone, girl. It's been dry since the 50s. You're just digging your own debt." "The water is there," I'd reply, never stopping my swing. I ignored the chemical shortcuts. I used fermented compost, biochar, and cover crops that looked like weeds to the untrained eye, but were actually pumping nitrogen into the gray earth. I spent a year building a gravity-fed irrigation system, utilizing the hidden mountain runoff that the vein experts had overlooked. Arthur called me once during a particularly brutal winter. I was shivering by a small wood stove, my fingers cramped from a day of pruning in the sleet. "How's the Empire, Diana?" he asked, the sound of a jazz club humming in the background. "I heard from the bank that you're nearly maxed out on your credit. Just say the word and I'll buy the land from you. I could use it as a tax write-off for a hunting lodge. I'll even give you enough to rent a nice studio in Jersey." "The land isn't for sale, Arthur," I said, looking at the dark outlines of my vines, standing like silent soldiers in the snow. "And I'm not for sale." He snapped. "Enjoy the poverty. It seems to suit your aesthetic." He didn't know that the poverty was a cocoon, and he didn't know that the soil had finally broken its silence. By the 5th year, the miracle happened. The grapes didn't just grow, they exploded with a concentrated volcanic intensity that defied every conventional winemaking rule. I didn't sell them to the big labels. I processed them in the old stone cellar I had reinforced with reclaimed timber. I branded the wine Solstice Ruin. The world was shifting. Luxury was no longer about gold leaf. It was about authenticity. It was about terroir, the taste of the struggle. My first vintage was discovered by a boutique sommelier from Tokyo who happened to be lost in the valley. Within 6 months, Solstice Ruin was being poured in the most exclusive clubs in London and Dubai. I didn't stop with wine. I used the profits to build a retreat, a sanctuary of minimalist luxury, integrated into the cliffs, powered by the sun and the wind. It became the playground for the world's elite who wanted to disconnect from the steel and glass world my brother adored. As I entered the 6th year, Dry Creek Ridge was worth more than the Vein headquarters in Manhattan. I was sitting on my porch, watching the sunset turn the vines into liquid amethyst, when my phone buzzed with a news alert. Vein Global declares bankruptcy following massive embezzlement scandal. CEO Arthur Vane's assets seized. I felt a cold, sharp spark of satisfaction. The skyscrapers had fallen. The steel and glass had shattered. A few days later, a cloud of dust appeared on my horizon. A single, dented SUV was limping towards my gates. I didn't need a telescope to know who was inside. I didn't reach for a checkbook, and I didn't reach for the phone. I walked to the shed and pulled out 3 pairs of heavy, mud-stained gloves and a set of rusted hose. The successors of the ruins were finally here, and for the first time in their lives, they were going to learn what it actually means to build something from the ground up. The golden hour at Dry Creek Ridge was a spectacle of light and shadow, turning the rows of vines into disciplined ranks of emerald fire. I stood on the cantilevered terrace of the main lodge, a structure of glass and rammed earth that seemed to grow out of the cliffside itself. My name is Diana, and for 6 years this silence has been my greatest luxury. It is a silence I bought with every blister on my hands and every sleepless night spent praying for rain. The peace was shattered by the rhythmic metallic clatter of a dying engine, a battered, dusty SUV, the kind of vehicle that would have been towed away from Arthur's Manhattan office as an eyesore, struggled up the winding gravel driveway. It limped past the solar arrays and the high-tech fermentation tanks, coming to a shuddering halt in front of the main entrance. The doors creaked open, and for a moment, time seemed to fold back on itself. Arthur stepped first. His $5,000 bespoke suit was a map of stains and wrinkles, his silk tie hanging limp like a dead snake. Behind him came our cousin, Beatrice, and her husband, Leo, the very people who had toasted to my burial in the dust at the funeral. They looked skeletal, their eyes wide with a mixture of disbelief and a hunger so raw it was almost predatory. "Diana?" Arthur croaked, shielding his eyes from the brutal glare of the setting sun. He looked up at the terrace, his voice trembling with a forced, pathetic familiarity. Is that really you? We saw the feature in Vogue Living. We thought it was a joke, a PR stunt. But this is a fortress." "It's a farm, Arthur," I said, my voice carrying effortlessly across the valley. "A patch of rocks and weeds, remember?" "Diana, darling, we are so glad you're doing well," Beatrice chimed in, her voice pitched in that high, artificial frequency she used when she wanted something. She clutched a designer handbag that was peeling at the edges. "It's been so stressful in the city. The regulators, the lawyers, they took everything, even the family jewels. Arthur said you'd have a suite for us. After all, blood is thicker than water, isn't it?" "Water is very thin, Dry Creek, Beatrice," I replied, walking down the stone steps. My heavy leather work boots thudded against the ground, a stark contrast to their scuffed Italian loafers. Arthur walked toward me, his old arrogance trying to claw its way back to the surface. "Look, we've had a minor setback, a temporary liquidity crisis. We just need a few weeks to regroup, a place to stay, some of that boutique wine everyone is talking about, and maybe a quiet office where I can start consulting. You clearly need someone with executive experience to manage this scale of operation. I can take over the back-end logistics while you stay in the garden." I stopped a few feet from them. The smell of expensive cologne and desperate sweat was a poison in the clean mountain air. I didn't see the titans of industry anymore. I saw scavengers looking for a fresh kill. "You want to manage the logistics, Arthur?" I asked, a slow smile touching my lips. "Good. Because the logistics of the North Block are currently failing. The organic compost piles need turning, all 10 tons of them, and the irrigation trenches in the shale field are blocked with sediment from the spring runoff. It's hard work, the kind that requires a simple mind and a strong back." "You're joking," Leo stammered, looking at the sprawling, minimalist guest villas in the distance. "We're your guests. We'll stay in one of those units. We can discuss the labor over dinner. I hear your chef is world-class." "Those units are fully booked by people who pay $20,000 a week to support our reforestation project." I reached behind the terrace wall and pulled out 3 sets of heavy-duty, mud-stained work gloves and the rusted, iron-headed hose I had used in my first year. I tossed them into the dust at their feet. The clang of metal against stone was the final bell of their old lives. "You aren't guests," I said, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous growl. "You are refugees. In this valley, if you don't contribute to the earth doesn't feed you. There are 3 cots in the old tool shed, the one with the tin roof. It has a wood stove and a hand pump for water. If you want to eat at the staff table, you will report to the foreman at 4:30 a.m.
If you don't, well, the road back to the city is long, and I hear the shelters are quite crowded this time of year." "Diana, you can't be serious," Arthur shouted, his face reddening with a surge of his old temper. "This is an insult. We are the Vanes." "The Vanes are bankrupt, Arthur," I said, turning my back on them and heading toward the lodge. "The ruins have new owners now. I suggest you start with the South Trench. The sun sets in 30 minutes, and the temperature in the tool shed drops quickly. Welcome to the dirt." I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I heard the sound of the metal tools being picked up, slowly, painfully, and with the heavy weight of a pride that was finally being buried.
The morning mist at Dry Creek Ridge was a cold, clinging shroud that smelled of damp sage and awakening earth. At 4:30 a.m., the valley was a theater of silence, broken only by the rhythmic clink of my boots against the gravel. I stood by the tool shed, the very same shack where I had spent my first winter shivering, and watched as the three titans of Manhattan stumbled out into the pre-dawn chill. Arthur looked like a man who had been processed by a meat grinder. His face was puffy, his eyes bloodshot, and his hands, those soft, pampered hands, were already beginning to blister from the previous evening's introduction to the shovel. Beatrice followed, her designer leggings ruined by the red clay of the South Trench, her expression a mask of pure, concentrated venom. "The foreman is waiting at the north block," I said, leaning against a weathered fence post. I didn't offer them coffee. I didn't offer them a seat. "The solar sensors are reporting a blockage in the drip line. You'll be digging it out by hand. No machines. We don't disturb the root systems of the reserve vines with heavy equipment." "This is slavery, Diana," Leo spat, his voice cracking with exhaustion. "You're worth millions. You have an automated bottling plant and a drone surveillance system. Why are we playing with dirt like medieval peasants?" "Because you need to understand the weight of what you threw away," I replied, my voice as cold as the mountain runoff. "Now move. The sun doesn't wait for your complaints." As they trudged toward the hills, I headed to my office, but I wasn't just checking the fermentation logs. I was watching the security feed. I knew Arthur. He didn't have the stamina for redemption, but he had a PhD in sabotage. By noon, the cameras caught him. He had separated from the group, claiming a back injury. Instead of resting, he was creeping toward the high-security nursery, the greenhouse where I developed the drought-resistant rootstocks that were the secret to Solstice Ruin's success. I watched through a hidden lens as he pulled out a burner phone, one he must have hidden in his shoe. He was taking photos of the nutrient mixtures and the proprietary grafting techniques. "I have the sequence, Miller," he heard me whisper into the phone, his voice buzzing with a desperate, manic energy. "The formulas, the soil ratios, everything. This is worth at least $5 million to the Mondavi conglomerates. Just get me out of here. This place is a madhouse." I didn't stop him. Not yet. I wanted him to think he had found the gold. That evening, as they sat around the small wood stove in the shed, eating the simple vegetable stew the kitchen staff provided, I walked in. The air was thick with the smell of wood smoke and the bitter scent of Arthur's unearned hope. "Hard day?" I asked, sitting on a crate near the door. "Exhausting," Arthur said, trying to flatten his expression into one of weary compliance. "But I think I'm starting to see the appeal, Diana, the connection to the land. It's humbling." "Is it?" I asked, tossing a small encrypted flash drive on the dirt floor between them. Arthur froze. He looked at the drive, then at me, the color draining from his face until he looked like a ghost in the flickering firelight. "That drive contains the digital watermarks of the files you stole today, Arthur," I replied, my voice dropping to a low, clinical tone. "Every photo you took triggered a silent alert.
Every formula you copied is actually a decoy, a chemical compound that would turn a vineyard into a graveyard within a month. If you sell that to Miller, you won't just be a bankrupt businessman, you'll be a fugitive wanted for corporate espionage and massive property damage.
Diana, I can explain, he stammered, reaching for the drive.
There's nothing to explain, I said, standing up. You saw this land as a tax write-off, then a prison, and finally a payday. You never saw it as a life. You're so addicted to the shortcut that you can't even see the path right in front of you. What are you going to do? Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling. Are you going to call the police? No, I said, walking to the door. The police are for people who still have something to lose. You have nothing but your pride, and that's currently rotting in the mud of the North Block. Tomorrow is the great harvest, the most important day of the year. You will work from dawn until the final crate is loaded. If you try to leave, the gates are locked. If you try to call Miller again, I'll release the footage of you attempting to poison a multi-million-dollar eco-reserve to the feds. I looked at Arthur, the man who laughed at my simple mind while he sat in his Manhattan throne. The dirt doesn't lie, Arthur, and tomorrow it's going to tell us exactly who you are. I closed the door, leaving them in the dark with the flash drive and the realization that their only wealth was the dirt under their nails. The harvest was coming, and I was going to make sure they felt every single ounce of the burden they had mocked.
The morning of the great harvest arrived with a sky the color of bruised plums, bleeding into a brilliant, triumphant gold as the sun crested the ridges. This was the day that defined solstice ruin. The air was electric, filled with a scent of crushed sugar and ancient dust. Investors from Paris, sommeliers from Tokyo, and environmental critics from New York had arrived in silent electric shuttles, their linen suits and silk scarves a sharp contrast to the rugged, volcanic terrain. I stood at the edge of the plateau, wearing my work-worn leather vest over a clean white shirt. My name is Diana, and today I wasn't just a farmer. I was the architect of a legacy that had outlasted the skyscrapers. "Arthur, Beatrice, Leo," I called out, my voice cutting through the morning mist. They emerged from the tool shed, their faces gaunt, their bodies aching from a week of labor they never thought they'd endure. I pointed to a row of heavy, antique wooden crates, the founder's batch, located at the very top of the steepest incline. "The guests are watching," I said, gesturing to the elite crowd gathered on the glass observation deck. "They want to see the traditional method. You three will be the carriers. You will haul those crates down the shale path to the press. Every grape must be handled as if it were a diamond. If you drop a single cluster, you don't eat tonight." "Diana, look at us," Beatrice cried, her voice cracking as she looked at the crowd of people she used to call her peers. "That's the CEO of Estee Lauder up there. That's Julian from the hedge fund. You're parading us like circus animals." "I'm parading you like workers, Beatrice," I said, stepping closer. "Something you've never been. You wanted to share in the bounty of the Vane name? Well, this is the only Vane bounty left. Pick up the crates." For the next 4 hours, the titans of Manhattan performed a grueling public penance. Under the scorching sun and the curious, pitying gazes of the world's elite, Arthur struggled under the weight of the oak boxes. He slipped on the loose shale, his hands bleeding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Every time he looked up at the observation deck, he saw someone he had once looked down upon, now watching him crawl in the dirt. At noon, the final crate was loaded into the press. I signaled for the guests to gather around the central courtyard. 6 years ago, I began, my voice amplified by the natural acoustics of the stone walls. This land was called a ruin. It was described as a fitting grave for a woman without ambition.
The men who owned the world laughed at the idea that anything of value could come from this dust. I looked directly at Arthur, who was leaning against a stone pillar, trembling and covered in the very mud he had mocked. But today, I continued, Dry Creek Ridge produces the most sought-after vintage in the world, and as of this morning, Solstice Ruin has officially acquired the remaining title deeds and the trademark of Vane Global. The name that once represented hollow towers now represents the restoration of the earth. A murmur of shock ran through the crowd. Arthur's eyes widened. He hadn't known I had bought the carcass of his company from the liquidators. I am officially retiring the Vane name from the corporate world, I announced. It will now serve as the name of our scholarship fund for land regeneration. As for my assistance today, I paused, let the silence hang until it was uncomfortable. They have completed their first week of honest work. Their debt to the family name is settled. Arthur, Beatrice, Leo, there is a shuttle waiting at the gate. It will take you to the station. You have enough in your pockets for a one-way ticket back to the city. That's it? Arthur croaked, his voice thick with a mixture of relief and a crushing final realization of his insignificance. You're just throwing us out? I'm giving you exactly what you gave me, Arthur, I said, stepping toward him. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a small, dried-up grapevine, the very first one I had planted that died in the drought. I pressed it in his hand. A dead branch and a chance to start over. Let's see if you can grow anything in the city with nothing but your corporate experience. I turned my back on them for the final time. I didn't watch them walk toward the gate. I didn't listen for the sound of the shuttle. I walked to the press, picked up a glass of the first run of the new vintage, and raised it to the sun. The successors of the ruins were gone. The skyscrapers were a memory. I looked out over my emerald hills, the vines heavy with the fruit of my labor, and I finally understood what my father never did. You don't own the land, you belong to it, and if you treat it with respect, it will give you a kingdom that no bank can ever seize. My name is Diana. I am the daughter of the dirt, the queen of the ridge, and for the first time in my life, the air I breathe is completely, undeniably pure.